Hello, and welcome to Roundtable Mindset, the podcast where we seek to understand and share different perspectives in order to grow and challenge our own. And we encourage you, our guests, to do the same.
Each week, we will pick a topic to discuss, sharing our own unique thoughts and insights. There will be times when we won't agree, and let's be real, that'll probably be most of the time, and that's okay. We feel it's important to understand that we can live in this polarized world and still respect one another and even be friends.
Well, welcome back, listeners of the Roundtable Mindset. I'm Jamie.
And this is Mahlon.
And we're here to bring some new, exciting perspectives to you today. And if you're just joining us for the first time, every time you hear the word perspective, we're going to start a game. Or not. It's okay. So today we're going to start with our food for thought. Mahlon, you said you had something to talk about today for that.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm starting to really enjoy this little segment that we started at the beginning of the episode. I have to say that first and foremost, Jamie. But I do have something for today, which I was a little surprised about, so I don't mind sharing. It's work-related, of course. But I'm a little bit surprised that it kind of happened. And here's what took place, and kind of shocked my perspective a little bit. So I'm at work, and the day is going great. And I get a message from my boss, and actually it's not my direct boss, it's one of the business partners that I work with. And we go into a regular meeting just like we would any other time, and we had topics and agendas that we had to go over. And about the end, she's like, I need to reserve a couple minutes just to talk with you, Mahlon. And I said, sure. So we got through the meeting. And again, no indication that there was anything wrong. Wasn't picking up anything over the last couple days. So I was really surprised when she started talking about how she is feeling like she's not being communicated with enough. And in particular, the work that I'm working on for her, she's not really knowing where it's at, what state it is, and when it's going to be completed. And Jamie, when I tell you I was absolutely flabbergasted, I had no words. I heard my business partner talking to me in the way that she was feeling like she was not being communicated to enough. And I'm sitting here racking my brain about all the different things that I'm currently doing for her and how I'm communicating with her. And I am no longer listening to her, but I am now cataloging in my mind all the things that I'm currently doing that disproves what she's saying to me. So, I mean, can you relate to that on any level?
I so can. How often do we go into a conversation and prepare a response without even really hearing what's being said to us, right?
Exactly. And I fell into that trap because I had an emotional reaction to a statement that was given to me, which I think that happens to a lot of people. I think everybody has the best of intentions to go into every conversation to say, I'm going to be a great listener. And then all of a sudden you're being told something that your emotions react to more than your mind. At least that's what was happening for me. And suddenly everything that we've talked about in the last couple of episodes, everything that I've been practicing just went right out the window. And here I am now creating a list of all the things I'm getting ready to tell her that this is why you're wrong. And I really stopped myself because at the end of it, I'm like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I'm doing. What matters is she's not getting enough from me. And I had to stop in the middle of that in my mind. And I had to say, stop thinking, start listening. And I repeated that to myself a couple times. Stop thinking, start listening. And I was listening to what she was having to say. I was trying to put down all the things that I'm already doing. And I realized after she was talking, and I think we said this in another episode, it wasn't even about me. All of this that she was talking about had nothing to do with me and had everything to do with how she was being overwhelmed in her current role and all the responsibilities that were on her shoulders and how she was feeling like everything was slipping out of control. And all she wanted me to do was reassure her where we were at with her projects and where we were at with all the items that were on my list that I was working on for her. So it started out with me trying to be argumentative with her in my mind and trying to disprove that, no, I'm communicating you very well. Here's everything that I'm doing, to the other end of the spectrum, which is it had nothing to do with me or anything that I was working on. It had everything to do with her responding to her level of anxiety and how she was kind of pushing that out onto me.
Hmm. It's also interesting to think too, though, about like, because I've known you a long time. You were a really good communicator. Um, like sometimes really good communicator. Like
That's a polite word to say. I over communicate sometimes.
every once in a while. Not that I'm not guilty of the same thing, because let's be frank, I am. But um, sometimes it's not about like you said, it's not about us, but it's also thinking about how the person that we're communicating with can receive the messages that that we're trying to give them. You know what I mean? So, from her perspective or from another person's perspective, am I able to hear what you're saying? Am I in a space that I can hear what you're saying? And are you communicating in a way that works for me? And how important that is as a piece of communication, not just that we're able to express ourselves in written and verbal ways, but also that we're able to express ourselves in a way that our listener can understand and receive it. So what a great example. And seriously, I do you ever look back on situations and think, okay, if this had happened 10 years ago, would I have been able to stop and not like fight the good fight, right?
Well, and exactly, again, self-reflection is something that I really like to do, especially, hey, let's see how I've evolved over time, because distance helps with eyesight in that regard. And you're right, 10 years ago, I would have been like not even caring what she was saying because I'm going to prove you wrong. Here's everything. I have emails, I have meetings set up, I have documentation. Here's all the things that I'm doing to communicate to you. There's no way that I'm failing you. You have to be the one that's wrong. There's a problem here, and the problem is with you. What I was able to do just last week was everything that I mentioned. But here's the beautiful part, and I would have missed this. My younger self would have missed this, Jamie, is I was able to listen to her, and I realized again she was having an emotional reaction to something that was happening at her level that I wasn't aware of. I don't need to be aware of, but she was feeling like she was losing control. So all she needed was a sympathetic ear where I was there listening to say, okay, I hear you, but then let's put a plan together so you feel like you're more in control. And what that turned into for me, Jamie, was I just had two things that I shifted on my side, which was I will make sure that at the end of a couple meetings that we have a month, that I will document the outcomes of those and send them to you. And then she reviews a list of the work that is currently being done. So then she can provide more up to date feedback on the items that are being worked on. So she feels like she is more in control of those pieces. And just doing those two things shifted the whole dynamic of the conversation. And I could just see her whole body exhale. And she was like, okay, thank you. Thank you for listening and thank you for taking action. I really appreciate that. And there really wasn't anything else that I needed to do on my end other than listen and make her and change two little things to make her feel like, yes, and remind her she is in control and things will be okay. But had that been the younger version of myself 5, 10 years ago, that outcome would have been completely different.
Hmm. It's amazing the power of listening with empathy and then offering support. It is not just for it's not just for human services. Clearly.
Well, and outside of your and I's conversations and relationship, Jamie, I don't think I ever even would have recognized that was a part of that. I would never have even, you and I would have had conversations and said everything that you do, and our worlds are so far apart. And I think this is a good example of how they're really not that different. Yes, what I work on, and I'll say this 100 times, I work on widgets, but I work with people. And as long as you work with people, I think there's always going to be that element. And so um, it just was a cool reminder of how what even we talk about even off of the podcast, how it relates so much to I think both of our industries very well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm glad you got to I'm glad you recognized it in the middle of that because for me, so often I get to the end of it and I reflect back on it and think, oh, crud, I missed it. So it's cool that you were able to catch that in the middle of the conversation. That's awesome.
Well, and I will say it was towards the middle to the end of the conversation because I spent quite a bit of time being like, no, that's not right. You're not, no, this is what I'm doing. You're missing it. And luckily, yeah, it took me till about the middle part of the conversation. I realized just stop thinking, start listening. So,
If you're anything like me, when you start to recognize it, you'll start recognizing it earlier and earlier, and the skill will just grow. So, way to go in catching it in the middle anyway. At
yep.
least it wasn't after.
At least it wasn't after, and it was something. It didn't have to impact the relationship. There wasn't, going back afterwards to say, "Hey, I'm really sorry. All you wanted was someone to listen to you, and I didn't do that, and I apologize." So it did save me that piece of it. So I'll take the win. But food for thought last week is again, stop thinking, start listening.
Good food for thought. Love it. Love it. So, this week, we have a conversation for you. Um, we are going to talk a little bit about losing a loved one. It's, so many of the things that we talk about on our podcast are, you know, kind of based on experiences, and everyone's experience can be different. And even experiencing the loss of a loved one can be different, but it is something that we're all going to experience at some point. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it's like to lose a loved one and how it's changed or shaped our perspective.
Yeah, and as you know, Jamie, this was probably a topic 7, 8 years ago. I would have very little interest in talking about just because personally, I was fortunate enough not to have experienced a loss of a loved one up until that time. And about 7 years ago, it was in October, I lost my mother. And then literally the same day, 2 years apart, I lost my sister. And so when you and I were talking about this topic, it really resonated with me this time around, and more so now, because I can take a step back and I can understand what that means to lose a loved one. Up until that time, like I said, my extended family and I are not very close, and so I never really experienced the death of grandparents or aunts or uncles. Don't have a lot of cousins on my side, on either side of the family. So really my immediate family were the only ones that I really would have an opportunity to experience that. And so I just remember when my mom passed, just how much of my world shifted. And luckily enough, I was an adult when that happened. But even then, I think one of the first thoughts I had was, there hasn't been a day on this earth that I haven't opened my eyes and had my mom, where I could either have called her, walked down the hall to see her, emailed her, or sent her a mail, anything. And that day changed all that. And it was almost a realization that said, from this point forward, I will never be able to do any of those things again. And in that moment, it was really kind of reorienting my compass, if you will, because luckily I still have my dad with me. But just having that loss, that gigantic loss, was something that I had never experienced before. So my perspective almost instantaneously started shifting.
Well, and I can relate to that too. I remember it was about 16 years ago for me that my mom passed away. I was quite a bit younger than you were, clearly, since it was so much longer ago. But it's interesting because it took a long time. It took a long time for me not to have that instant reaction when you have a question, or like, oh, I want to make mom Swedish meatballs, right? Like that instant thought of, oh, I'll just give her a call. Like it took some time to I guess get through that. But I think that the thing that I remember, I guess a perspective shift I remember for me was I'm half an orphan, right? Like my dad is still here, but now I'm half an orphan. it was like this sudden understanding or realization that eventually I will be the oldest member of my family. And so carrying on those traditions and that family story and those pieces of our family that our parents do for us naturally will eventually be my responsibility. And that was something I had never considered before that, you know?
There are things now that I have to think about that I never had to think about before because I just took for granted that's something my parents did. And that's something that
Mhm.
my parents will continue to do. And, you know, I consider myself a relatively intelligent individual, and I know that not everybody lives forever. But for some reason, it is a lot easier to push out the concept of tomorrow I will wake up and one of my parents won't be here than it is to just say, I don't have to plan for it right now because it's not around the corner. It's not going to happen tomorrow. And that was one of the shifts that happened for me is I heard it 1,000 times growing up. You know, what's the old saying go? Don't put off tomorrow what you can do today.
Mhm.
And I'm like, yeah, great, This after this event, after I losing my mom, that became a whole new way of thinking. Like suddenly it was possible. I could see the possibility of tomorrow not coming. Whereas before, yeah, in theory, I agree with you. I can see how you would think that, but I've never experienced that. And I really am not going to take the time to mull that over now because I'm too busy. After losing my mom, suddenly it was tangible. Suddenly my mortality was tangible. I remember, again, I was a little bit older than you when you lost your mom, Jamie. But I remember afterwards just starting to think, my days are numbered. Suddenly I'm not going to be around forever. I might be around for 40, 30, 40 more years. And I don't want to sound morbid and I don't want our listeners to walk away with, wow, this is a depressing topic. It was just so remarkable on how fast that dynamic shift had to happen. And maybe it was because I was older and all my brothers and sisters were, out of the house and we were kind of scattered throughout the United States, um, where I started thinking about that. But suddenly, even in that moment, I started looking at my dad differently and started thinking there needs to be somebody else who can help take care of him now. And so that, I don't want to call it burden because it's not a burden, but that responsibility all of a sudden fell very heavily on my shoulders,
Mhm.
where the day before I wasn't even thinking about that. I wasn't,
Right.
I knew the day would come when I would probably have to step in and help my aging parents, but that wasn't tomorrow, and that certainly wasn't today. And suddenly I felt all that pressure coming on me as, no, it's here now. Are you prepared for it?
Right. Right. Well, and I think one of the interesting things is too how the person you lose, how the perspective is different based on who it is that has been lost. You know what I mean? Like me losing a parent was very, very difficult. Um, I wonder how the perspective would shift and what you might reflect on as a parent losing a child, um, or even you've lost a sibling. You know how different that feeling is, or what the perspective is from a different loss that's still close. What was that? I mean, if you don't mind sharing,
No, I don't.
was it the same kind of feeling, or was it like different lessons learned in that process?
So I will say one of the main things between my my mom passing and my sister passing is the order, right? So I think I would have ultimately been in the same place no matter which order would have happened. But I think having my mom go first, to your point earlier, not that my sister's death was any less important, but
Hmm.
having the first death be such a significant role model or, individual in my life was probably more jarring and jeering than it would have been if I maybe lost a sibling before losing a parent.
Hmm.
But I will say that losing a sibling is still painful. It's still there's still grief and mourning that you have to do. There's still loss that you feel. There's missed opportunities that you start going back in your mind saying, oh, I saw them call that one time and I let it go to voicemail. I shouldn't have let it go to voicemail. I should have answered it. All the what ifs start coming back. The woulda, shoulda, couldas. But I will say there is a little bit of a difference, at least for me, that there was, because again, I held my mom and my dad at such high regard, and they've always been the leaders of the family. And my brothers and sisters at a relatively young age, we all kind of went our separate ways. And I think I've already shared this in another episode where my sister was almost 10 years older than me. So by the time I was going through the formative years of, even middle school, high school, she was already well established outside of the house. She was actually living states away from me. So I don't want to say that it was less impactful, but I do think that there is a difference even between those two deaths happening within 2 years of each other, literally on the same day. But it still hurts. It's still there's a loss there. If that makes any sense.
It does. It does. Well, and I think for me, it really helped me. It helped me think through. I don't want to say like legacy or something like some big, bold word like that, but it did kind of help me think about like what lessons am I instilling for my children? Like, am I giving them everything I need to give them, and am I giving them those lessons that I want them to have? Is there one more thing I wish my mom could have told me about, or that kind of thinking, as well as like some super, I don't know, there were some super practical things too that came of that for me. Like, um, I don't know if you know this about me. I feel like I'm pretty good in a crisis. Like I'm a doer. So you present a problem, I take care of a problem, and that's how I keep myself busy and keep my feelings out of it. Like the more I can do, the more I can stuff, the better I am. And it was probably, I don't know, it was over a year. It was over, well, no, almost a year later that I finally like felt the loss of my mom. Um, but I remember after the funeral, after the funeral, I was like, I am not going to do this to my children. I am going to pre-plan everything so that they don't, because that was some grueling stuff. Like right after this horrible loss, this surprising loss for us, it wasn't an expected death. And then they're like, my mom and dad were separated during that time. So then the responsibility of everything fell on my brother and I. And my brother was just over 20, I think, at the time. Like he was like 23, I think. So it was like all on me. And I remember just thinking how cruel, how cruel this is. Like, sorry, your mom's gone, but could you pick some flowers out and let's talk about a program? And do you want a poem or a picture? You know what I mean? Like,
Right. And
it was just a.
how do you plan for those things when those things seem so insignificant after the event that just took place?
Exactly.
Like one of the things I remember, I was by my mom's bedside, and I remember she had just passed away, and I glanced out the window, and there was two people leaving the hospital parking lot, and they were I could tell they were talking, and they had it was two ladies, and they had their purses, and they were going to the car, and I just thought for a minute, and I thought, I bet they're on their way to lunch. They're leaving work. For them, this is a job. They're going to have some lunch, or maybe they're going home. And I remember thinking how mad I was because here this enormous event just took place in my life. And I wanted the earth to shake. I wanted people to stop. I wanted time to just cease for just a moment for me to be able to catch my breath. And I remember thinking, none of it doesn't affect anybody outside of this room, and it should. And it just made me mad. It just made me very, very angry.
Yeah. Well, and I do think, I think how has that shaped me as a person? I was under 30 when my mom passed away. And so how has that shaped me as an adult moving forward without my mom there? It's I definitely remember and even now think about you said missed opportunities and how we, okay, my mom and I didn't talk for a long while. So we talked earlier about when it's okay to walk away. Well, sometimes it's okay with family too, and I had to. So there was a separation for the two of us for a while, and just probably a handful of months before she passed away, we started talking again. And and after she passed away, I thought, oh my gosh, all of the things that she's missed, all of those um, all of those times that the celebrations and the milestones and things like that with my family and with my kids. And so I definitely, there are times where if one of my kids want to spend time with me, I take advantage of those times because I want them to have every last one of those that they wanted. You know what I mean? Um, and there's often times that I think about that. I think about like, huh, my mom and I never went to lunch when I was an adult. Like it wasn't a thing. So if my kid asked me if I want to do lunch, the answer is yes, please, every time because those are memories I didn't get to have. So it's definitely pushed me to make memories that I don't know that I would have been aware of before having that loss in my life.
I can relate to that, and I it sounds so morbid to say, like, what are the positives that can come out of it? But I try to be a positive person. My mom, I know our listeners didn't have a chance to meet her, but you did, Jamie, and she was a driving force, and she was full of what I call momisms, and she wouldn't let you sit there and wallow in your own self pity. And during that time, I remember thinking, um, this is so unfair. This is so unfair.
Mhm.
And one of my mom's favorite, and I'm going to share it, and I'll probably share more as we have more and more episodes, but one of my mom's favorite sayings was, "Whoever told you life was fair?" And I probably heard that 1,000 times a month growing up. And I remember saying to myself, I will never say that to my children. That is so annoying, because she was so right. That was one of the perspectives that I had to have, was I truly started understanding there are things that are going to happen to us, around us, happen to loved ones, friends, family, that just is so unfair. But nobody ever said life was going to be fair. So again, another little perspective shifted was suddenly all of these momisms that I was given growing up, um, suddenly start taking on new meaning because there's practical uses to it now. I suddenly can
Mhm.
relate to what that truly means on a very deep level, and it almost gives me another. It almost validates them more than what they were before. Um, so if that makes sense, but it just on a deeper level just made it seem like, oh yeah, there's wisdom there, and I can apply that wisdom now. I'm starting to understand what that means. It's not just surface level words. Go down a couple layers and really analyze what she was trying to say to me. And I don't think I could have got there without an event like that happening. So again, I don't want to be morbid and say this is the positive that came out of this, but looking for silver linings, I would say that perspective was probably one that I really do cherish, because one, it makes me feel the closest to my mom, and two, it's giving me the best part of her, which was that wisdom that she passed on.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, and I trying really hard not to share stories that aren't mine on this podcast. But I do know, like for my brother and I, when mom passed away, there was a lot of shifting for us. Um, I saw so much change come about for him and for me in that time that I can't say that they were like there was positive things, but at the same time, the growth that happened after that um, was immense. You know what I mean? We learned so much from that experience that I can't help but be grateful um, that that I that I had people around me to help me grow through that and to get through that difficult time um, with some strength. You know what I mean? Because I do feel like the experience gave me some strength that I don't know that I had before that.
No, yes, and I would say to kind of complement that, what it did for me right away is it made me start relying on other people. I am a very much I can fix this myself. Thank you very much for your concern, but I got this. And this was one of the times that I really had to say I can't do this on my own. And so luckily I had the support of my wife, but I also had to have the support of friends and family. And suddenly, for someone who's not, I joked before, registering very much on the emotional spectrum, I had to learn how to say, first of all, recognize that no, I need help because this is overwhelming. And two, be okay enough to ask other people to help and then okay for them to actually help. And
Mhm.
that was a very humbling time for me that, again, I don't know if I would have willingly walked into that because that's an uncomfortable space. However, being thrusted into that, it was almost that, fight or flight reaction. And
Right.
I needed to learn how to rely on that. So as much as I hear what you're saying in that strength that you got, I can almost say I had to learn how to start relying on the support around me more than just recognizing that it's there for me to use and actually start using it, which
Mhm.
really was odd for me.
Well, and I do, I think those people that we are close to and that we care about would want us to get through those hard times, and if nothing else, find some new strength or find some new perspective in those things. You know what I mean? So I always think, um, that would make my mom really happy. But what about, I guess, what about a more removed situation, like a grandparent or a friend, or I can definitely say that losing my mom was the closest loss I had ever had, but it wasn't my first. There was other family, grandparents and things like that, and I don't know if you remember, we had a friend in, was it middle school, um, that had passed away, that was pretty tragic and unexpected. But I guess I kind of want to talk a little bit about how I think every huge loss like that can be traumatic, but how sometimes the way it happens can impact us in different ways too. So if it was a very tragic, like a tragic accident or some awful situation that was really unexpected or maybe even preventable, how that might shift the way you experience that. Do you have any do you have any experiences like that, or
So I will say that yes, I had some what I call adopted grandparents that when I was growing up that passed away, and so that was hard. Um, did attend their funeral. Both of them were huge staples in my life. The classmate that you're speaking about, Jamie, again, that was very abrupt, very tragic. Um, but not to sound morbid, but how I got through that was putting up that wall that says that really is terrible for them and that tragedy happened but outside of my circle. So I was almost like a casual observer. So at a very surface level, I was able to offer condolences and be like trying to relate to individuals and trying to do what I thought was the right thing to help comfort them, not knowing really what that meant to really have that loss. Because again, for me, my mom was the first loss that I had. And some can say that I was fortunate or unfortunate, however you look at it. But I didn't have to really learn what it meant to be empathetic to someone, to really put yourself in somebody's shoes until that happened. I wish I could sit here and say that I was better at it growing up, even as a young adult, all the way through my 20s and 30s. But I never really had a situation that really opened up and showed me what it meant to be empathetic to someone who was really experiencing a loss or a devastation until that moment. And so reflecting back, I can say, yes, I said all the right words. I did all the right things. I went to the funeral. I said I was sorry to the family. But knowing I had that security of, well, that happened to them, that happened outside of my circle, that's too bad, but I'm okay because I'm insulated. Once it went through and hit the part of me that was no longer insulated, that's when I felt that rawness. That's when I felt all those things where now I can suddenly go back and say, oh, I now know what they were going through, and I can understand how really unhelpful what I was saying to them really was, because I know when I was going through it, sometimes I didn't need anybody to say anything. Sometimes I just needed them to put their arms around me. Sometimes I needed them just to be in the same room with me. Sometimes I needed just to have that space where nobody would talk to me. That comes with experience. So I guess I'll say is, yes, I've experienced those things, but it was more at a superficial level for me because nothing rang that bell as hard as it did when I lost my mom. But what about you, Jamie? Did you experience anything that was kind of similar to that? I've never lost a grandparent that I was close to yet, so I don't even have that experience to kind of draw from.
Yeah, I definitely think my mom was the closest for sure. Um, I do think that after you're absolutely right. After that loss, it was like once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. And it made me such a better support for people that I care about that had been going through those same things um, when they went through it, because it was like, yep, I've been there. But it was interesting to me because the last close person to someone that I love that passed away, it was like I could see myself having a choice. Like I could choose to separate myself from it because I know what that feels like and I know how hard it is, or I can choose to feel it with them and experience it with them so that they didn't have to go through it by themselves. And so I almost didn't recognize the choice. You know what I mean? Like I almost just went ahead and was like, nope, checking out. Don't want to go there again because that sucks. And it hurt really hard and I don't want to get near that again. But I'm so grateful that I recognized that space where I had the opportunity to say, okay, nope, they need me and I need to be there with them during this time, and they need someone who gets it and who's been there and can say, yeah, I felt that pain and I'm so sorry. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and so do you think that that has helped you in your profession and personal life to get closer to people? Having experienced something like that, do you think that there's a new skill that you've adapted or you've maybe sharpened since you've had that experience that you can kind of go back to say, hey, I've either discovered this about myself or I'm making this a stronger tool that I'm going to use going forward, and it all roots back into that loss that you felt. Do you have anything like that you're experiencing?
It's hard to say. It's like a whole chicken and egg thing, right? The work that I do really is it really is about supporting people in very, very difficult times. And it's interesting that we're kind of talking about this because one of the things that we talk a lot about is that how sometimes grief and loss isn't just about death of a loved one. Sometimes grief and loss comes um, because what you expected was going to be there, what you expected to happen doesn't happen. And so I deal a lot of that, like in things like that in my work. When you're working in mental health and human services, and you expect this amazing future for your kiddo, and then you get slammed with this big diagnosis, and you have to shift your mindset a little bit about that. There's a grief process that happens in that. So it's hard to know if I it's hard to know if my work has shaped that in me or if I've been able to just apply that in my work, you know? Um, Either way, I'm so grateful for the experiences because I do think that it gives me an opportunity to really stop and think, well, kind of like we were talking about in Food for Thought. What does this person need in this situation, and how can I be of support to them as they're going through and experiencing this thing that I've been through? And what that will mean to them to have somebody that can say, yeah, I get it, and I've been there. I
Yeah.
don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. And again, knowing what you do, I can see how that could be a difficult question to say, yes, this is it, because again, chicken and the egg, what influenced the other more? Or is the answer, yes, both things experience, both those experiences have helped shape the response to either one of them. As you were talking, and I was kind of doing some reflection on what I've already stated in this podcast. One of the things, looking for a different perspective that I gained, one of the things that I had to learn to do, as I said, I would show people support at a superficial level. So if there was a loved one that they lost, I would come and say all the right things, and I'd attend the funeral, and I'd say, oh, I'm so sorry, and if you need anything, and then I would never check back up or ever do anything for the individual, because it really at that time wasn't about actually being available for them if they needed me. It was just about me saying those words, so then I could say, okay, I was supportive because I said those words. I had to learn that there are people that would be saying that to me, and I had to learn how to navigate those waters, because just as much as I was thrown in to the deep end of those types of feelings and experiences, I had to learn there was other people that were giving me those superficial answers. Does that make sense? And
Yep.
how do I respond to them, where I didn't want to be angry because I was in their shoes 24 hours before, and now suddenly I have a whole new perspective. I'm wearing these brand new shoes, like it or not, but now I have to go almost retrofit this perspective backwards to say, I understand now why you're saying these words, but you really aren't meaning them. And I'm not going to be offended by those. I'm just going to accept what you can give me at this time, which is the words and not the actions. And that was something that I was not expecting, because there were some individuals in my life that I would expect that would be able to do the actions, and they did not. It was just about they needed to say the words to me, and that was enough for them, and they could feel like they've really reached out and helped me, and my family, when in actuality there was probably other things they could have done that really would have showed support, especially in that difficult time. And it would have been really easy for me to be very angry with them, but I had to stop and understand that's where they were at. That's where they felt comfortable, just like that's where I felt comfortable, because it didn't resonate with me before that moment, just how I could relate to somebody that was experiencing a loss. And that was a surprising revelation for me, because now suddenly I have to give sympathy or understanding to individuals when I'm in the middle of this crisis for myself. That was hard. Did you experience anything like that? Am I just rambling?
No, I do remember. Of course, at the time, I was so young, and I was pretty dysfunctional. Like, I mean, just in and of myself. I was like, so I got really frustrated. I got frustrated with like constantly feeling like I had to take care of other people. Does that make sense? Like, people would come and like I felt this overwhelming sense to comfort other people in that time, and I'm like, I became really frustrated with that. Like, if there's anything I can do, and then I'm like, oh, well, they're great. There's another thing I have to think of, something that you can do to help me. You know what I mean? It was so I did not handle it very well at the time. I don't think I was pretty raw. I was exhausted, when and there was like a hospital stay involved that lasted a couple of days, and so I was just um I was not at my best anyway, but then you add on top of that, well, and then the throng of family that comes into town, and yeah, it was a whole experience for me. But I guess one thing I did think about as we were talking about discussing this topic on the podcast too was, I feel like you and I have a good perspective about. I don't feel like you and I dwell in it. You know what I mean? Like we're stuck in that space. And I don't know if that's just because of time or if that's because of how we were raised or where that ability comes from. But um, I have had family members that like really kind of get stuck in that space of, like, it's almost like they can't, or they really struggle to move to a space where they can go on. That, um, the anniversary of things constantly takes them back to that original space of grief and things like that. And so I wondered if you had any experience with that kind of grieving process.
Yes, and I don't know if this is a real term or not, so this is going to be a Mahlonism. But I almost think what I experienced was a delayed grief because my day-to-day life, I didn't see my mom. I live, almost 8 hours away from where my parents live now because I left for my job. And so for me, my day-to-day life is about not seeing them. And so it was very normal to be back at home where I don't see them every day and I don't interact with them all the time. So it was almost like I could put my grief on pause because it didn't happen. It was very easy to be like, that didn't happen. She's okay. She's living back at home. I just haven't talked to her in a while, but that's normal. And not seeing her every day is normal. And it was me going back and visiting my dad where all of a sudden I'd walk into a house where she was no longer present. And it would be almost picking up that grief where I left it off and having to feel those emotions, even though months had passed. For me, it was just the next day after the funeral or whenever the last time I saw my dad. And so, I experienced grief a little bit different with my mom because I feel like it happened a lot longer for me, not because I couldn't grapple with it or I couldn't come to terms with it, but more because it didn't feel real until I was in that environment, if that makes sense. And so my grief probably lasted a lot longer, and I had probably took a lot more time to work through it. But that's just because when I would come back home, suddenly everything felt normal. Everything felt like it was before she passed away because everything was normal here. And then when I start looking for the little things, the Facebook notifications or the likes or the loves and those aren't there anymore. There's a game that we played together that I noticed that her score wasn't updated. I mean, little things like that, but I called it a delayed grief because it's like I came back home and that was put on suspended animation because it was easy to do. It was easy just to pretend, no, everything's fine because everything felt fine. Everything felt normal because that was what every day was like.
Well, and yeah, I think I experienced it very similarly. Because it was a time, and it literally took a movie. Um, I finally months later had the whole house to myself for one afternoon, and I watched Stepmom. Have you ever seen that movie with Julia
Julia
Roberts? And
Roberts.
yes, we have talked about. Have we talked about Julia Roberts on here before? Because I feel like we have. Um, but
Last episode we did. It was you picked up a book because of the cover, which had Julia Roberts.
oh my gosh, see, look, I'm not obsessed, but she is one of my favorite actresses. So, I was watching Stepmom, and it's all about. I mean, it really is all about the process of preparing children for the loss of their mom. And oh my gosh, I like ugly cried, sobbed from my gut, like, and it was like all those months of stuffing and, you know, not dealing with stuff came up at one time. And then it wasn't very long after that my family member went through something similar, and watching watching everyone close to them really like just not be able to move through it, not be able to, like, it wasn't stuffing it, it was almost like just being stuck with that person. But then I look back at like the whole dynamic of the entire group, and it was like that was just normal for them. You know what I mean? Like that was how they were raised. And so the whole dynamic of the family was um that we don't talk about it, but we talk about it. You know what I mean? Like Um, yeah, it was just interesting to me how different families experience the grief and loss in different ways also, and how that changes based on how our parents experience grief, how our parents display grief to us, and how they deal with those losses, and then how we turn around and deal with those losses too. Um, I ended up um, going to a counselor with that family member, and they told me um, it is the best predictor of how someone is going to deal with the grief and the loss of a loved one is based on how their parents dealt with the grief and loss of a loved one, and how their parents dealt with the grief and the loss of a loved one, because it really does kind of pass down through generations, because that's the example that we have. Um, so it was really important to me when my kids have experienced those different losses to be able to show them healthy ways to cope with that. That isn't the stuffing that is my typical go-to. Like have
Oh,
those
that's
conversations and honor that memory and experience that.
yeah. I was gonna say that's my jam too. Is just to stuff it and put it into a bottle and cork it really tight and say, "Oh, I'll come around later and deal with it." Like I am a
Hmm.
pro stuffer. And it took actually till you're talking right now that I realized I wasn't close with my grandfather on my dad's side, but I remember my dad coming home and saying that his dad passed away. And it wasn't that there was a stressed relationship or anything. I just they lived so far away. We didn't have a lot of money, so traveling wasn't an option. They didn't really travel. So I never really had an opportunity to know who they were. And he passed away. And I remember seeing my dad cry for a little bit, and then he kind of put on his bootstraps and went through and kind of dealt with the situation, went back to his mom, made sure everything got put into order, and then he came home. And it wasn't until literally talking about it right now, Jamie, that I realized that's exactly what I did for my dad. So when my mom passed, I didn't want my dad to go home by himself and have to drive, 5.5, 7 hours, 5.5, 6 hours back home. So I drove him home because I felt that sense of I needed to make sure my dad was taken care of. I need to make sure my dad gets settled as much as he can, help him tie up some loose ends. And then once that's all taken care of, then I can resume my life. And it took my wife to kind of talk to me about, at the time that it was happening, and said, "Hey, you have your family here that you need to think about." And literally did not even cross my mind until we had this conversation right now that that's what I saw my dad do. My dad dropped everything, flew to his mom, made sure she was taken care of, got everything all situated, and then he came back. And that is the behavior that I modeled during the crisis. And so that's very interesting you said that, because again, that didn't even cross my mind until you just said that, and I reflected and I'm like, that's exactly what happened for me.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm so grateful that I had that conversation and that I got that wisdom, because I don't think I dealt with it in the most healthy way, and I definitely didn't want to. I can't say that my kids have experienced a great loss yet, but I definitely wanted to model for them um, when we have had family members, extended family, and things like that that have passed away. I've tried really hard to model what I wish I would have known then, or how I wish I could have responded if I didn't understood what I was going through at the time, being as young as I was. So yeah, it was a good perspective shift for me, in that, what am I teaching my kids as they watch me go through grief and loss, and how I respond.
Right. And the other dynamic for me that I was kind of taken off by surprise, because I think you've talked a lot about how you're helping your kids. One of the things for me was suddenly the paradigm between my dad and I shifted. I don't know if you experienced that. I know you said your mom and dad were separated, but suddenly my dad, he felt like he became my responsibility. Again, I don't want to say burden. He was never a burden. He never asked for anything. This was more me saying, okay, I need to step up now. But that was another.
It was you taking ownership of that, huh?
Yeah, and
Yep.
that was weird where it's like, okay, Dad, our our whole relationship has shifted, and it's shifted not because I don't think you're capable of taking care of yourself. It's because you're aging and now mom is gone and you need a layer of support that you were getting from mom that you're no longer getting. And I remember having the conversation with my brother and my sister, even after mom passed, and said, okay, how are we going to come alongside and support dad? Again, my dad's not a frail person. He works like 48 hours a week still. He's very active. But it was just that overwhelming idea now that, okay, I have to step up. My brother and sisters, we have to step up. We have to now start supporting and helping and taking a more vested interest in things that, as a child, I know you'll get a kick out of this, Jamie. Finances were something that my parents were very tight-lipped about. We didn't ask how much they made. You don't ask how much is in the bank account. You don't know anything. You're a kid. You're blind to all of that. Just be thankful that we feed you, right? Like that's that was the mantra growing up. And suddenly I'm having conversations with my dad where I'm like, I need to know if you have any kind of health insurance, and okay, what's your life insurance policies like? What do you have in for savings? What do you have in for retirement? And suddenly these taboo things that I was growing up with, where you never got to ask because it was none of your business, and your parents were never shy to tell you it's none of your business. Suddenly there's these conversations that I'm going to him saying, you no longer have an option to tell me no, because this is how our relationship is now. And that was very weird and very awkward at the
Yeah.
beginning.
I don't know that hasn't been part of my experience yet, mostly because I think when I think my parents are quite a bit younger than your parents anyway. And so when my mom passed away, my dad was still pretty young. So I didn't have a bunch of concerns, and he wasn't alone. Like, I know there's people around him that are there for him and stuff like that. But I do know that is kind of what I saw. I saw my dad do that as my grandparents. My grandma was sick and terminal, and so watching that with my dad and my uncle happen with my grandparents, that was a really weird experience. And I thought about that. What will that look like for our family when that time comes? Um, when I'm asking those questions, do you have a plan? What do I need to know? How can I support you as these things progress and advance and stuff like that? Um, it was something that I noticed, but I don't know that I don't know that I recognized that I was noticing that when it was happening. You know what I mean? So thanks for sharing that, because that does make me think, huh, I did get to see what that looked like for them. And that was really weird because we also didn't talk about that stuff when I was younger, but my grandparents were even more tight-lipped about it. So I'm sure that was a weird experience for my dad and his brother too in
Oh,
those
I'm sure
days.
we're talking about topics here that you could have got your mouth slapped for asking when you were younger. And now suddenly you're like, no, really, we have to have that conversation. I
Right.
I can relate. So I want to ask you maybe one last question here, Jamie. Everything we've talked about and the perspectives that we've gained, and through the grief and the mourning, have you taken anything away that helps you? Like, can you pinpoint any extra skills or ways that you can relate to individuals that maybe you didn't have before you experienced that loss that you use towards people today?
I think so often when you're in the middle of those experiences, you feel so alone. And you often feel like nobody gets it. Nobody's been there. Like, you know what I mean? Like, or this is you couldn't possibly understand. And I think that for me, it's been uh it's been nice to hear your perspective because I feel less alone in that. Um I feel less alone in the idea that I stuffed those feelings for as long as I could until it just exploded. um I guess to know that maybe I don't. That's not me being a terrible human being. That's just the style that I chose at the time to cope with it. So I appreciate that. I feel like that really helps me because sometimes I do feel like um, when I have like acquaintances or people that I know or work with that have gone through this, sometimes I feel a little cold about it. Like I wish I could be there, hugging and crying with them and things like that. Um, but it's just not my personality. Like I'm one of, I have a great deal of empathy for people and what they're experiencing, but it's really hard for me sometimes to let myself feel those things with someone, if that makes sense. Um, so it's kind of nice to not feel like in that area that I'm emotionally stunted, that maybe maybe it may not have been the most healthy choice, but it is a way to cope in a way that I'm not alone in coping with that. So thanks for sharing that and bringing this topic this week.
Yeah, I think if I did a little bit of self-reflection and kind of asked myself that same question, I think what I would come to understand is I thought before I had to be part of the grand gesture to be helpful or to be useful to someone. Like kind of what you just said, to be there, to cry with somebody or to make sure you do all these elaborate things for them so then they don't have to think about those things or have to do them themselves. But I think what this experience has done for me is really made me understand don't overlook the small or the mundane things for people that are going through that, because I think you said it when you were giving your experience was sometimes those little questions that you get asked, what's the flowers? What songs do you want? Um, how many people are you going to have? Did you write the obituary? Like there's all these questions that come at you that they expect you to have the answers to, that I remember thinking if I could just give somebody else, and again, we had help, so I don't want to say that it was all on my shoulders or my brother's or my dad's shoulders. We had help. But in just looking back, I would say I don't want to overlook the small mundane things that I can do to help people, because sometimes the smallest things or the quietest things you can do for someone has the loudest impact. And so for me, I don't need to look for the grandiose gestures anymore or the hollow words. To me, it's about finding those moments where I can help somebody maybe with the small things, the mundane things that have the true impact to be able to help them. So I guess my takeaways from all of this, if I thought through it, would be that just not to wait for the grandiose, but to help somebody with the day to day, especially when they're going
Yeah.
through that.
Yeah. Well, and to be able to do that with more empathy because you've experienced it. I think that is a piece of the experience that I'm grateful for, is that I can relate to that, and I can offer that kind of support because I've been there. So yeah, it's good. It's a good topic. So as we wrap up, um, I guess I just wanted to say we've had a couple of phone calls to our phone number, and so I just want to thank whoever it was. It was an anonymous suggestion for a topic, and we'll be tackling that here in the next coming weeks. Um, but I just wanted to say thank you to our listeners who have decided to drop us a voicemail. Um, you can also drop us a text, which is kind of cool. Malin, do you I don't have it in front of me. Can you share our phone number with our guests?
Sure. So as Jamie said, we have a phone number now, so you can either call or text, leave us a voicemail, or text us at 402-819-8999.
Yes. So that's one way you can reach us, or you can also use our email, roundtablemindset@gmail.com. It's kind of cool that we're starting to interact with some of you, our guests, as we're starting out here in our fifth episode of our podcast. So it's been such a pleasure, and sometimes we're going to throw these topics in too, it's just so you can get to know us a little bit better, and I think. I don't know, Malin, you and I have been friends for so long, but sometimes we always I still always learn new things about you. So these kind of conversations are cool for me too, as your friend, to just get to know you a little better and hear your perspective on things that I would have assumed about.
Right.
I wouldn't. I don't know that I would have known some of the perspectives you've gained or some of the experiences you had through that. So thanks for sharing that with us
Yeah,
today.
absolutely. And again, part of what we're doing, why we put this all together was to show those times when we think we look at even individuals in our lives that, what, for us it's been 30 plus years, that we're like, yeah, I know everything about them, and then suddenly you hear some nuance that you're like, wow, I'm blown away. There's a whole nother layer to that individual. And I know I take for granted too sometimes that I know everything there is about you, Jamie, and nothing's going to surprise me. And then we have these types of conversations, and we try to get a little bit more real with one another, and it brings different ideas to the table. It brings a different awareness. I feel like I get a even better glimpse into who you are, and I love that we share that with everybody listening, because I think that was one of our main goals as we put this podcast together, is we wanted to be authentic, and we wanted to talk about things that um, make us real and relatable. And I think this was a topic that did that, because I think you said it earlier, everyone's going to experience this at one point in their lives.
Mhm.
And so we might go through that experience differently, and we might be able to learn from one another through those experiences, but there's not going to be one of us that doesn't ever have a loss in our life. So I like these types of these types of topics, and I love what we can learn from one another as well.
Yes, yes. Well, it's been a good conversation. We look forward to meeting with you again next week when we bring a new topic to the table to discuss, and hopefully some new perspectives come to both of us and to you too. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
This podcast was recorded and edited by Jamie and Mahlon, with music by Famous Cats. If you have a topic you'd like us to discuss, please email us at roundtablemindset@gmail.com. And never miss a new episode by making sure you like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
If you enjoyed your time with us today, do us a favor and invite a friend. Thanks for listening. Please join us next time at the round table, and remember, your opinion and perspective matter, and we might not see eye to eye, but that's okay.